Hello and welcome back to this course of videos on node.js, the Express framework and socket.io. Now in the previous video we looked at WebSockets and we actually looked at the steps that occur when a user first downloads this index.html page. And if you remember what happened, we looked at the connection event listener here, so io.sockets.on connection, and what occurred when the user first connected by downloading this index.html page. In this video, we're going to continue looking at WebSockets, but we're going to start looking at sending messages back and forth between the client and the server. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is here, what happens when a user first logs in to our chat application. So I'm just going to log in here as James1, hit go. As you can see, all that happens is the page is dynamically updated and the online users div here is added with one particular user. So let's have a look behind the scenes at how that works. So if I look at my main.js, which is my client-side JavaScript, first of all, we looked in the previous video when we instantiated our socket object by running the io.connect method. So this instantiates our socket object on the client side. And if you can see, I've passed this socket object into my event listeners function because obviously when I'm adding my event listeners here, I need access to that socket object because some of my event listeners here are using the WebSocket protocol. So to look at the click event, so the click event when we log in as a user, this is the event handler here, regular event handler. So we listen to the click event, prevent default. This session storage, so I'm actually checking if the username already exists, and I'm leveraging session storage on the client side to check. You'll see later on where we actually store the username to session storage. I'm pulling the username from here, and then we're running our AJAX request. So again, this isn't a WebSockets communication here. We're using the regular HTTP protocol to do an AJAX post request to the /URL. We're sending JSON. We are stringifying the username that we've just taken from here. And then on the success handler, so what this AJAX request does, and we covered it a couple of videos ago, is it queries the Mongo database to see if the particular username exists in the Mongo database. Now, if it does, the Mongo database then responds back, and we get past this data object, which contains the username, the first name, and the last name. So I use the JSON.path, turn that from JSON back into a regular JavaScript object. Now you can see here, so upon success, what I'm doing is I'm populating session storage with three properties here, username, first name, and last name, that I've got back from Mongo on the response. And then I'm also using those three pieces of data to dynamically update the page. So we get our first name, last name, and we get our username. And so now the big difference is I'm actually running the emit method on the socket event. So again, if you remember, we passed through the socket object into our event listeners function here. And so I'm using it now to emit, and I'm emitting a message called new user to server, because if you remember, we have our user array on the server, and that user array is what we use to populate this online users section here. So I first need to emit this message to the server to update the array, and I'm going to send object.username as my data. So I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to go over to server side, and I'm going to find excuse me, new user to server. There we go. So again, we're talking about brothers and sister here. So socket.emit, new user to server, is sending, and then the sister here is receiving, socket.on, new user to server. There's a data that is being passed in the callback function as a parameter in this callback function here. And that's the data that we're communicating here, which is object.username. So you can see, so this is our username object. You see, I'm pushing it to the array to update the data, sorry, to update the user's array with the new user that has just been added. This piece of code here, now this is interesting. So if you can see, I'm actually socket is the object that reflects the WebSocket connection that we're dealing with. Now, to take a step back here, all of these event listeners here are instantiated, begin listening upon the first connection. So you can see here this io.sockets.on connection. Upon connection, we create all these listeners: news to server, message to server, disconnect. So all of these are created, and they're created with this socket object that relates to the particular WebSocket connection that you're making. So this socket new user to server is actually starts listening upon connection. And so this socket is the socket that you connected when the user first downloaded the page, which is what we covered in the first video. So this socket object, what I'm actually doing is I'm customizing this socket object by adding a username property. And that username property is going to be the username that was passed in on the socket.emit here. So not only am I adding this user to my users array, I'm also adding it as a property on the socket object. And you'll see why that is useful later when we move to the disconnect event listener, because we actually use that property on the socket object to basically remove the user from the user's array. So to get back to this particular event listener, so we're adding the new user, which was James1, to the array. We are then adding that same username as a property to the socket object, and then we are emitting back to the client. Now you'll notice the difference here is we're saying io.sockets. This is plural, you see. This is because we are emitting to all clients. So now we've actually updated our users array. We need to communicate back the updated user array to all sockets, so to all users. And we can see that work in the sense that if I open up a new tab here, and I download the index.html and I log in as Jake1, so you can see the online users array has been emitted back and populated dynamically on this front end. But I've actually emitted back to all users, not just to Jake. I've emitted back to all. So if I go back to the James user session, you can see that's been updated as well, because I emitted back to sockets, all sockets with this user array. So the same applies when users disconnect from the application. So if you look, I have the Jake page here and the James page here, which both have both users reflected in the online user section. If I disconnect Jake by closing down the browser, you see that immediately the array on the James page is reduced, because immediately we've re-emitted the updated array to all sockets, reflecting the fact that Jake is now offline. So I think that's a good place to leave it as we're approaching the 10-minute mark. Now, in the next video, we will be looking at what happens when we actually send messages back and forth using the chat functionality in this application. And I look forward to seeing you then.